Sable had always known she was expendable. Growing up as the youngest daughter of a minor pack elder in the Thornfeld territory, she had learned early that her value was measured not by who she was, but by what she could be traded for. Grain in a famine, favor with a neighboring lord, silence from a creditor. She had simply never imagined the currency would be peace. The treaty delegation arrived at dawn, 6 wolves from Thornfeld's ruling council, a cart of provisions meant to look generous but was mostly salted mutton and last season's root vegetables, and Sable. She sat in the back of the cart with her hands folded in her lap and a single trunk of belongings wedged between 2 barrels of dried fish. No one spoke to her. No one had spoken to her since her father had explained, with remarkable calm, that she would be leaving. "The Kale pack requires a bond offering," he had said, standing in the doorway of her room while she packed. "A daughter of Thornfeld blood, given freely to live among them. It is the final condition of the armistice." Freely. As if anyone had asked her. Her mother had not come to say goodbye. Her sisters had watched from a window on the second floor, their faces pale, their hands gripping the sill. None of them had volunteered. None of them had been asked to. Sable was the youngest, the quietest, the one whose absence would cause the least disruption. She understood the logic. She even understood the necessity. That did not stop it from feeling like being thrown overboard to lighten a sinking ship. The Kale pack controlled the northern reaches, a vast and brutal territory carved out of frozen forest and black stone. Their alpha king, Kale Avanthes, had waged a 3-year campaign against every southern pack that had tried to push into his borders. The stories that filtered south were the kind told in whispers. He had broken the Ashworth alliance in a single night. He had held the Grey March Pass against 400 wolves with barely 60 of his own. Thornfeld had been the last to surrender. 300 of their wolves had died in the final siege alone. Now they wanted peace, and peace apparently looked like a 22-year-old herbalist with calloused hands and no political value whatsoever. The journey north took 4 days. The landscape changed gradually, green hills giving way to dark pines, then to towering ancient forest where the canopy blocked out the sun entirely. By the 3rd day, the air tasted different. Colder, sharper, carrying the scent of something wild and territorial that made the wolves in their escort grow tense and watchful. On the 4th morning, they reached the Ashenir fortress. Sable stared up at it from the cart and felt her stomach drop. It was enormous, built into the mountainside itself, its walls dark granite streaked with veins of iron that caught the weak northern light. It looked less like a castle and more like something that had grown out of the rock, ancient and patient and impossible to tear down. The gates opened. The cart rolled through. The courtyard was full of wolves. Not all shifted, but enough. Massive creatures with pale eyes and thick fur, watching the delegation with open hostility. The human members of the pack were no friendlier. Hard faces, scarred hands, eyes that had seen too much killing to bother with courtesy. The Thornfeld counselors climbed out of the cart with the exaggerated dignity of men trying not to look terrified. Sable climbed out after them, her legs stiff from 4 days of travel, and landed badly on the cobblestones. She stumbled, caught herself, and straightened up to find every eye in the courtyard locked on her. Heat flooded her face. She smoothed her skirt, lifted her chin, and tried to look like someone who had chosen to be here. The pack parted. He came through them like a blade through water. Tall, broader than any man she had ever seen, with dark hair cropped close and a jaw that looked like it had been carved from the same granite as his fortress. His presence was suffocating. Not just the size of him, though that was considerable, but the sheer gravitational weight of his authority. Every wolf in the courtyard oriented toward him instinctively. Some lowered their eyes, some bared their throats. Kale Avanthes, Alpha King of the Kale Pack, stopped 10 feet from the delegation and surveyed them with eyes the color of winter iron. The lead counselor stepped forward and began the formal greeting, a rehearsed speech about mutual respect and shared prosperity that sounded hollow even in the open air. The Alpha King listened without expression. His gaze moved across the delegation, cataloging, assessing, dismissing. Then his eyes found Sable. He went completely still, not the careful stillness of a man composing his expression, but the sudden, involuntary stillness of someone who had been struck. His jaw tightened, his nostrils flared. The iron-gray eyes locked onto her with an intensity that felt like a hand closing around her throat. The counselor was still talking. The Alpha King was not listening. He was staring at Sable with an expression she could not read, something between shock and fury and something else, something raw and unguarded that vanished behind his eyes before she could name it. The silence spread outward. The counselor trailed off. The courtyard held its breath. Sable's heart hammered so hard she could feel it in her fingertips. She wanted to look away, but could not. His gaze pinned her in place like a specimen under glass. Then, without a word, the Alpha King turned and walked back into the fortress. The courtyard erupted in murmurs. The counselors exchanged panicked glances. A tall woman with close-cropped silver hair and a scar running from her temple to her jaw stepped forward from the king's retinue. She studied Sable with sharp, assessing eyes. "I am Drenna," she said. "The king's second. You will come with me." Sable's legs moved because they had been told to. Her mind was still in the courtyard, still trapped in the gravity of that stare. What had just happened? And more importantly, why had the most dangerous alpha in the Northern Territories looked at her like she had just broken something inside him? The room they gave her was in the Eastern Tower. It was small, sparsely furnished, and freezing. A narrow bed with a wool blanket that smelled of cedar. A washstand with a chipped basin. A window no wider than her forearm that looked out over the mountainside and offered a view of nothing but pine trees and gray sky for miles. Drenna stood in the doorway and watched Sable set her trunk at the foot of the bed. "Meals are served in the lower hall at sunrise and sundown," the second said. "You are not a prisoner, but you are not pack either. You will not wander the upper corridors without escort. You will not approach the king's quarters. You will not enter the war rooms." "Understood," Sable said, though her voice came out smaller than she intended. "Good." Drenna paused, her scarred face unreadable. "The king wishes to see you. Tomorrow morning, in his study." Sable's pulse spiked. "Why?" Something flickered in Drenna's expression, not quite sympathy, but close. "You will find out tomorrow." She left. The door closed with a sound that echoed through the stone walls like a sentence being handed down. Sable sat on the edge of the bed and pressed her hands against her knees to stop them from shaking. She was supposed to be invisible. A symbolic gesture, proof that Thornfeld trusted the armistice. She was supposed to fade quietly into the background and be forgotten. No one had told her the king would look at her like that. She did not sleep. At dawn, a guard arrived. A young man with pale eyes who would not meet her gaze. "The king is ready," he said. The walk to the king's study felt endless. Down the tower stairs, through a corridor of dark stone lit by guttering torches, past doors that were closed and guarded, and finally to a heavy oak door banded with iron. The guard knocked once, then stepped aside. "Enter," came the voice from within, low and flat, and carrying no warmth at all. Sable pushed the door open and stepped inside. The study was larger than her entire room, lined with shelves of leather-bound books and stacked correspondence. Maps covered one wall entirely, pinned and annotated in a sharp, angular hand. A fire burned in the hearth, and the air smelled of wood smoke and ink, and something underneath it all that made her wolf stir restlessly beneath her skin. Him. Kale Aventhus sat behind a desk of dark wood, his back to the window, his face cast in shadow. He did not look up when she entered. His pen moved steadily across a document, the scratch of it the only sound in the room. Sable stood in the center of the floor and waited. Her hands were clasped behind her back to hide the trembling. 1 minute passed, then 2, then 3. Finally, he set the pen down. He looked up. Those iron eyes hit her again with the same force as the courtyard, and she felt her breath catch. Up close, she could see things the distance had hidden, the bruised hollows beneath his eyes, the gauntness in his cheeks that spoke of something deeper than tiredness, the fine lines of tension carved into his forehead that did not belong on a man who could not have been older than 30. "Your name," he said. "Sable Thornfeld, Your Majesty." "Your role in the Thornfeld pack?" "Herbalist. I worked in their infirmary." His eyes narrowed slightly. "They sent a healer." "They sent their least important daughter," Sable corrected before she could stop herself. The words hung in the air between them. She regretted them instantly, but the king did not look offended. Something shifted in his expression, subtle and quickly suppressed, that might have been recognition, as if she had confirmed something he already suspected. "You will be examined by our healers," he said. "Drenna will make the arrangements." "Examined for what?" Sable asked. He did not answer. Instead, he studied her face with that same unnerving intensity from the courtyard. His nostrils flared again, and she watched his hands curl into fists on the desktop, the knuckles going white. "That is all," he said abruptly. "You are dismissed." Sable opened her mouth to ask one of the dozen questions burning in her throat, but his expression had shuttered closed. She turned and walked out on legs that felt like they might give way at any moment. In the corridor, she leaned against the cold stone wall and pressed a hand over her racing heart. He had smelled her. She was certain of it. Both times, in the courtyard and just now, he had caught her scent, and something had happened to him. Something he was fighting. The question was what? And the much more frightening question, the one that had been gnawing at the back of her mind since the courtyard, was why her wolf had responded to his scent with the same desperate, aching pull. The examination took place in the healer's quarters, a long, low-ceilinged room carved into the lower levels of the fortress that smelled of dried herbs and tallow candles and old stone. An elderly healer named Brindis, small and sharp-eyed with hands that moved with surgical precision, conducted the assessment while Drenna stood guard by the door. They tested everything: her blood, her reflexes, the sensitivity of her skin to various compounds, the strength of her wolf's response to standard alpha pheromone samples. They asked her questions about her lineage, her shifting history, her cycles, her health. Sable answered what she could, and tried not to feel like livestock being appraised. "Her scent profile is unusual," Brindis murmured to Drenna, reviewing the results. She seemed to have forgotten Sable was still in the room. "The base notes carry a calming compound I have not encountered before. It is subtle, but the chemical markers suggest an omega-adjacent sedative property." "Meaning what?" Drenna asked. "Meaning her natural scent may have a pacifying effect on certain alphas, particularly those with heightened cortisol and adrenaline, those in a sustained state of hypervigilance." The two women exchanged a look that Sable could not decipher. Drenna's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "What does that mean for me?" Sable asked. They both turned to look at her as if surprised she was still there. "Nothing you need to concern yourself with," Drenna said. "You may return to your room." That evening, Drenna appeared at her table in the lower hall during supper. "Come with me," the second said. Sable followed her through corridors she had not seen before, deeper into the fortress, then up a staircase that spiraled tightly until they reached a heavy iron-bound door guarded by two wolves in their shifted forms. Enormous creatures with white fur and pale, watchful eyes. Drenna pushed the door open. The room beyond was the king's private council chamber. A round table dominated the center, covered in maps and reports. 4 advisors sat around it, their conversation dying the moment Sable stepped inside. And at the head of the table, Kale Avanthes. He was not looking at her. His attention was fixed on a report in front of him, his brow furrowed, his pen tapping against the wood in an irregular rhythm. He looked worse than he had that morning. The shadows under his eyes had spread. His skin had taken on a grayish pallor that made her healer's instincts flare with alarm. "Sit," Drenna said, guiding Sable to a chair along the wall, well behind the king's position. "Do not speak. Do not draw attention. Simply sit." Sable sat. The council meeting resumed. She listened without understanding the politics, but she watched the king. He was deteriorating in front of her eyes. His responses grew slower. His head dipped forward once, a barely perceptible movement that he corrected immediately, blinking hard. His head dipped again, lower this time. One of the advisors paused mid-sentence, glancing at Drenna with wide eyes. The king's eyes closed. His pen slipped from his fingers and rolled across the table. His head came forward slowly, settling against his folded arms, and his breathing changed. Deepened, steadied. The rigid tension that held his body like a wire pulled taut, simply released. He was asleep. The room went absolutely silent. 4 advisors stared at the sleeping king with expressions ranging from shock to something that looked terrifyingly close to grief. One of them, an older man with a braided beard, pressed his hand over his mouth and looked away. Drenna moved to the door and mouthed 2 words at Sable. "Do not move." Sable did not move. She sat in that chair for over an hour, barely breathing, watching the Alpha King of the Northern Territories sleep on his own council table like a man who had not rested in months, because he had not. She was certain of that now. When Drenna finally gestured for her to leave, Sable rose on trembling legs and crept toward the door. She made it 3 steps into the corridor before Drenna caught her arm. "He woke within a minute of you leaving just now," Drenna said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Within a minute. He has not slept longer than a few moments in over 14 months. Sable stared at her. 14 months? Drenna's grip on her arm tightened. "What I am about to tell you does not leave this corridor. The king cannot sleep. He has not slept properly since the siege of Thornfeld. Every healer in the territory has tried, every remedy, every herb, every technique. Nothing works." Her scarred face was taut with something Sable recognized as barely contained fear. "Except, it appears, you?" The implication landed in Sable's chest like a stone dropped into still water. "That is why you brought me to the council room," Sable whispered. "You were testing it." "And it worked," Drenna confirmed. "He caught your scent and his body simply surrendered, the same scent that stopped him cold in the courtyard." A chill crawled through Sable despite the warmth of the corridor. "What happens now?" Drenna released her arm and straightened, her expression hardening back into its usual mask. "Now you wait. The king will decide what comes next." She turned and walked away, her bootsteps echoing off the stone, leaving Sable alone in the torchlit corridor with her pulse roaring in her ears and the terrible, dawning realization that she had not been brought to Ashenir as a peace offering. She had been brought here as a cure, and no one, not her father, not the Thornfeld Council, not even the king himself, had told her. 3 days passed before the summons came. 3 days of silence, of meals eaten alone, of pacing her tiny room and jumping at every knock on the door. 3 days of replaying Drenna's words and trying to make sense of what they meant for her future in this fortress. On the 4th morning, a guard appeared. "The king requests your presence in his chambers, this evening, at sundown." Sable's stomach dropped through the floor. His chambers. Not his study. Not the council room. His private chambers. She spent the rest of the day in barely controlled panic. She bathed, changed her clothes twice, braided her hair, unbraided it. She told herself the king probably wanted to discuss the arrangement in private. She told herself there was nothing to be nervous about. Her wolf disagreed with every one of those reassurances. At sundown, a guard led her through corridors she had never walked before. The upper levels of the fortress, where the stone was smoother and the torches burned cleaner, and the air carried the concentrated scent of the king so strongly that Sable had to clench her jaw to keep her wolf from whining. The guard stopped at a set of iron-banded doors and knocked. "Enter." That low voice, muffled by the thick wood, sent a shiver through her that she refused to acknowledge. His chambers were vast. Weapons lined the walls, a broadsword, a longbow of dark yew, a shield bearing the Avanthus crest. Bookshelves filled with texts, a fireplace large enough to stand in, burning low. And dominating the center of the room, impossible to ignore, the bed. It was enormous. Dark wood frame, thick furs, pillows arranged with the precision of a man who spent a great deal of time lying in that bed and failing to sleep. Sable's face burned. She fixed her gaze on the far wall and kept it there. The king stood by the window, his arms crossed, his back to her. When he turned, she saw the exhaustion written across every line of his face. He looked worse than he had 3 days ago. The exhaustion had carved itself deeper into his face. His skin had the translucent quality of someone running on nothing but will. "Drenna has explained the situation to you," he said. It was not a question. "She has, Your Majesty." "Then you understand what I am asking." Sable hesitated. "I understand the general concept, but I would prefer to hear it from you directly." Something flickered in his expression. Surprise, perhaps, that she would push back even gently. He uncrossed his arms and gestured stiffly toward the room. "I need to sleep," he said, and the admission cost him something visible. His jaw tightened around the words like they tasted of ash. "My healers believe your presence, specifically your scent, allows me to do that. I am asking you to sleep in this room." He paused, then added with clipped precision, "A separate bed will be arranged for you. This is not a request for anything beyond proximity." Sable nodded, her face still burning. "I understand." "No one outside this room, Drenna and Brindis, will know of this arrangement. If it becomes public knowledge that the king requires a Thornfeld woman to sleep, the political consequences would be severe. For both of us." "I understand," Sable repeated. He studied her for a long moment, those iron eyes searching her face for something she could not identify. "Why did you correct me?" he asked suddenly. Sable blinked. "When?" "In my study. When I noted they had sent a healer. You said they had sent their least important daughter." Her throat tightened. She had not expected him to remember that, much less bring it up. "Because it was the truth," she said quietly. The king was silent for a beat. Then he said, in a voice stripped of all formality, "They were wrong." Before Sable could process those words, he turned back to the window. "A cot will be brought in. You may arrange it wherever you are most comfortable. I retire late and rise early. The fire will be kept burning through the night." The cot arrived within the hour, narrow, firm, with a single wool blanket and a pillow that was a significant improvement over the one in her tower room. Someone had placed a small table beside it with a candle and a cup of water. She set up her things with the practiced efficiency of a woman who had spent years making small spaces feel livable. The king sat at his desk the entire time, reading correspondence, his back rigid, his pen moving in sharp, controlled strokes. He did not look at her. When the last candle was pinched out and the room settled into firelit darkness, Sable lay on the cot and stared at the ceiling. She could hear him breathing, the controlled, deliberate rhythm of a man forcing himself to relax. Minutes passed. She counted them by the slow crackle of the fire. His breathing changed. The rigid control loosened, gave way to something deeper and steadier, and took on the unmistakable cadence of sleep. Sable turned her head carefully and looked toward the bed. In the amber firelight she could see his face. The tension had drained from it. The hard line of his mouth had softened. He looked younger in sleep, less like a king, and more like a man who had been carrying something impossibly heavy for far too long and had finally, briefly, been allowed to set it down. Something in her chest ached at the sight of it. She watched him for longer than she should have. Then she turned away, pulled the blanket up to her chin, and closed her eyes. In the morning, she woke to pale gray light filtering through the narrow windows. The king was already awake, standing by the fire, fully dressed. When he heard her stir, he turned. Their eyes met across the dim room. "How long?" Sable asked, her voice rough with sleep. 6 hours, he said. The words came out unsteady. "I slept for 6 hours." She could see it in his face, in the way he held himself. Not just relief, but something close to disbelief. Like a man who had been drowning for 14 months and had just broken the surface. "Good," Sable said softly. She meant it. He opened his mouth as if to say something else, then closed it. His throat worked. He looked away toward the window, and she watched his hand grip the mantel, his knuckles going white. "Thank you," he said to the fire. Sable gathered her things quietly and left. In the corridor, she pressed her back against the cold stone and breathed. Her hands were shaking. Not from fear, not anymore. From the terrifying realization that she wanted to go back in there, that every step she took away from that room, away from him, felt like walking against a current that was pulling her steadily, irresistibly, towards something she was not prepared for. And from the even more terrifying suspicion that he felt it too. A rhythm formed. Each evening, after the fortress had settled into silence, Sable crossed the upper corridors to the king's chambers. Each morning she left before the household stirred. No one saw her come. No one saw her go. The secret held. In between, she lived 2 separate lives. During the day, she was the Thornfeld bond offering, a political footnote tolerated by the Kale wolves and largely ignored. She had been given work in the fortress healer's quarters at her own request, sorting herbs and grinding compounds under Brindis's watchful eye. It kept her hands busy and her mind occupied, and it earned her a grudging respect from the old healer who had clearly expected less from a southern wolf. At night, she belonged to the king's chambers. Not to the king, she reminded herself firmly, to the room, to the arrangement, to the strange, fragile miracle of watching the most feared alpha in the Northern Territories surrender to sleep simply because she was nearby. But the lines were blurring. It started with small things. A second blanket appeared on her cot one evening, thicker and softer than the first. She had not asked for it. The next night, the candle on her bedside table had been replaced with a proper oil lamp, the kind that burned steadily and did not gutter in drafts. A few days after that, a book appeared beside it. A healer's compendium of northern alpine flora, beautifully illustrated, with a leather cover worn soft from use. "Where did this come from?" Sable asked, holding up the book. Kale glanced up from the correspondence spread across his desk. "The library," he said, as if that explained everything. "Did you put it there?" His pen resumed its movement across the page. "You mentioned that the northern species were unfamiliar to you. The book seemed relevant." Sable bit the inside of her cheek to keep from smiling. He had been listening. Not just hearing her fill the silence with idle chatter about her work, but actually listening and remembering. She opened the book to a page on frost thistle and pretended to read, while something warm and dangerous expanded in her chest. The talking had started by accident. The first few nights, the silence between them had been absolute. 2 strangers in a dark room, separated by 10 feet of stone floor and a chasm of rank and history. But on the 4th night, He had not been able to sleep. After nearly an hour of listening to him fail, she had spoken without thinking. "There was a wolf at Thornfeld," she had said into the dark. "An old scout named Herrick who came to the infirmary every week claiming a different ailment. We all knew he was perfectly healthy. He just wanted someone to talk to. Eventually, the head healer figured it out and started giving him assignments. He showed up every day after that." Silence from the bed. Then, so quietly she almost missed it. "What happened to him?" "He died in the siege." The silence that followed was heavy. She had felt it settle and immediately regretted the words. "I am sorry," Kale said. 2 words. No defensiveness, just the raw weight of regret. "It was war," Sable replied. He would have understood. After that, talking became part of their routine. She told him about Thornfeld, about the infirmary, about the apprentices who set things on fire with alarming regularity, and the time she had accidentally created a salve that turned a patient's entire forearm bright orange for a week. He listened more than he spoke, but when he did respond, his observations were sharp and dry, and occasionally, unexpectedly, funny. "You turned a man orange," he said one night, the faintest trace of amusement in his voice. "Temporarily orange," Sable corrected. "It faded. Mostly. Mostly." There was a slight tint for another month, but honestly, it suited him. The sound he made was quiet, barely more than an exhale, but it was unmistakably a laugh. Sable's heart did something complicated and reckless in response. She was in trouble, because it was one thing to be drawn to him physically. The pull, the scent, the magnetic awareness of his presence that followed her through every waking moment. Those could be explained by biology, by pheromones and proximity, and the strange chemistry that Brindis had identified. But this was different. This was lying in the dark and wanting to hear his voice. This was catching his eye across the room and feeling seen in a way no one had ever bothered to see her before. This was the quiet, devastating realization that she liked him. Not the king, not the alpha, him. The exhausted, private, unexpectedly thoughtful man who left books on her table and remembered the names of people in her stories and laughed so rarely that the sound of it felt like something precious and stolen. One morning, she woke later than usual. The gray light was already brightening toward white, and the king was not by the fire. She turned her head and found him still in bed, awake, propped on one elbow and watching her. Their eyes met. Neither of them moved. The silence was not uncomfortable. It was full, charged with something that hummed between them like a wire pulled taut. She could feel it in her chest, in her skin, in the way her wolf pressed forward with a desperate, aching need she did not know how to contain. His gaze dropped to her mouth and stayed there for exactly 2 seconds before he looked away. "You should go," he said roughly, "before the household wakes." Sable left. Her heart was hammering. Her hands trembled as she dressed in the corridor. He had been watching her sleep. That night, Brindis delivered news that changed everything. "The Healers' Council has reviewed your case," the old woman said, her sharp eyes fixed on Sable across the workbench. "The data is conclusive. Your scent compound works at proximity, but its efficacy increases dramatically with physical closeness. Direct contact would provide the deepest, most sustained effect." Sable stared at her. "You are telling me I need to be closer to him. I am telling you the science supports it." "How much closer?" Brindis raised one eyebrow. "Considerably." The implication hung between them like smoke. "He will not agree to that," Sable said. "Then he will continue to deteriorate," Brindis replied, her voice clinical and unyielding. "The sleep he has been getting with you in the room is better than nothing, but it is not enough. His body is still failing. I give him perhaps 4 months at this rate." 4 months. The words landed like a blow to the sternum. "Tell him," Sable said, her voice steadier than she felt. "Tell him what you told me." He refused. "Absolutely not," Kale said, his voice flat and final. He stood behind his desk, arms crossed, every line of his body radiating closed, immovable resistance. Brindis stood opposite him, unintimidated by the alpha authority pouring off him in waves. "Your Majesty, the medical evidence is clear. I heard you the first time. Then you understand that without increased contact, your condition will continue to worsen. The sleep you are currently achieving is insufficient to reverse 14 months of damage. Then find another solution." "There is no other solution," Brindis said. "We have exhausted every alternative. She is the only remedy that works, and she is not working well enough at a distance." Kale's jaw clenched so hard Sable could see the muscle jumping beneath the skin. He did not look at her. He had not looked at her once since Brindis had begun speaking. "That will be all," he said. Brindis gathered her notes and left without argument, though the look she gave Sable on the way out said everything her mouth did not. The door closed. They were alone. "You know she is right," Sable said quietly. "I know what she is asking," Kale replied, still not looking at her. "And I will not put you in that position." "What position?" He turned then, and she saw it. The thing he had been hiding behind the refusal. Not stubbornness, not pride, fear. Raw, undisguised fear that she would be hurt, that she would be compromised, that he would take something from her that could not be given back. "You were sent here as a peace offering," he said. "Not as my—" He stopped, the word catching in his throat. "You did not choose this. Any of it." "I am choosing now," Sable said. His eyes closed. When he opened them again, they were guarded, shuttered, the iron wall firmly back in place. "The cot stays where it is," he said. "This conversation is over." It was not over. It lasted 3 more days. On the first night, she heard him failing to sleep. At some point past midnight, a strangled sound escaped him, bitten off quickly, followed by the sharp intake of someone jolted awake by something terrible. Sable sat up in the dark. "Your Majesty?" "Go back to sleep," he said tightly. On the second night, it was worse. He did not sleep at all. She could hear him pacing. At one point, he sat on the edge of the bed and his breathing went ragged, harsh, like something was being torn out of him. "Kale," she said, and it was the first time she had used his name without his title. The pacing stopped. "Please let me help," she whispered. Silence. Then, barely audible, "I cannot ask you to do that." "You are not asking. I am offering." More silence, so heavy it pressed against her like a physical weight. Then the sound of him lying back down, the mattress creaking under him, and the rigid, controlled breathing resuming its futile rhythm. On the third night, she simply got up from the cot, crossed the room in the dark, and sat on the edge of his bed. He went completely still. "What are you doing?" His voice was rough, strained, dangerous in a way that sent a shiver down her spine that had nothing to do with fear. "Sitting," Sable said. "Just sitting." She reached down and found his hand in the dark. His fingers were clenched into a fist. She wrapped both her hands around it and held on. For a long moment, nothing happened. His body remained rigid, his breathing controlled, every muscle coiled with resistance. Then his fist unclenched. His fingers opened slowly, tentatively, and laced through hers. His grip tightened, desperate and shaking, like he was holding on to the only solid thing in a world that was coming apart. His breathing changed, deepened, slowed. Within minutes, he was asleep. Sable sat on the edge of his bed, her hand in his, and listened to the sound of the most dangerous alpha in existence breathing peacefully for the first time in days. Tears burned in her eyes. She blinked them away furiously and did not let go. She must have dozed off sitting up, because she woke slumped sideways across the mattress, her hand still tangled in his. Sometime during the night, he had shifted. His arm was curved around her waist, her back pressed against his chest, and his face was buried in her hair. Her wolf surged with a need so visceral it stole her breath. She tried to ease away. His arm tightened instantly, pulling her back with a low sound that vibrated through his chest and into her bones. She stopped trying to move. When dawnlight crept through the windows, his breathing changed. She felt him wake, felt the exact moment consciousness returned, and he registered the position they were in. His entire body went rigid. Then, slowly, deliberately, he inhaled. Drew her scent deep into his lungs. His arm tightened around her waist, his hand spreading wide across her stomach, and a sound escaped him, raw and unguarded. Then he released her so abruptly she nearly rolled off the bed. She heard him cross the room. The door to his dressing chamber slammed shut. Sable lay in the tangled furs, her heart racing, her skin burning everywhere he had touched, and stared at the ceiling. This could not continue. The arrangement, the proximity, the careful pretense that this was nothing more than a medical necessity. Her body knew it was a lie. Her wolf knew. And after what had just happened, she was certain that his wolf knew too. That evening, Sable found Brindis in the healer's quarters. "I need to ask you something," Sable said, closing the door behind her. "About bonds." Brindis set down the mortar she was working with and studied Sable's face with those sharp, knowing eyes. "Go on." "Is it possible for a bond to form between two wolves who have not claimed each other? An incomplete bond. Something that exists before either of them acknowledges it?" Brindis was quiet for a long time. "Sit down, child." Sable sat. "What you are describing is not common," Brindis said carefully. "But it is not unheard of. A fated bond can begin forming through proximity and sustained contact, even without a formal claiming. The wolves recognize each other before the humans do. Physical separation becomes increasingly painful." Sable's throat constricted. "And if one of them is already dying? If the bond forms and he does not survive?" Brindis held her gaze. "Then the surviving mate rarely survives long after." The words landed in Sable's chest and stayed there, cold and heavy and real. "He is pushing me away to protect me," Sable said. "But that is the one thing that will guarantee we both die." "Yes," Brindis said simply. Sable stood. Her hands were steady. Her jaw was set. "Then I need to make him understand that." She did not get the chance. The next morning, a guard appeared at her door in the healer's quarters. Not the usual escort. This was a senior guard, an older wolf with a grim expression and a formal bearing that made Sable's stomach clench before he even opened his mouth. "The king has ordered a change in your arrangements," the guard said. "Effective immediately, you are to return to your quarters in the eastern tower. Your presence in the upper corridors will no longer be required." The words did not make sense. She heard them, processed them, but they refused to assemble into meaning. "I do not understand," Sable said carefully. "The arrangement was ongoing." "The king's orders are clear," the guard replied. "Your things have already been moved." Sable stood very still. Behind her, Brindis had gone quiet at her workbench. "May I speak with the king?" Sable asked. "The king is not receiving visitors." The guard waited. Sable walked past him on legs that felt disconnected from her body and made her way back to the eastern tower. Her cot was gone from the king's chambers. Her book, her lamp, her blankets, all of it had been returned to her small room in the tower and arranged with impersonal efficiency on the narrow bed, as if none of it had ever left. Sable sat on the edge of the bed and pressed her hands against her stomach where the ache had already begun. He had shut her out. The morning, when he had woken with his arms around her, when his wolf had responded before his mind could intervene, that was what had frightened him. He had felt the bond and panicked. Not because he did not want it, but because he believed it would endanger her. The first day without him was uncomfortable. A low, persistent tension in her muscles, a dull headache behind her eyes. The second day was worse. The headache deepened. Her appetite vanished. Her wolf paced endlessly beneath her skin. By the third day, she could barely stand. The pain had settled into her bones. She worked in the healer's quarters with the shutters drawn because the light had become unbearable. She caught glimpses of him twice. Both times, he did not look at her. Both times, the pull in her chest intensified so violently she had to press her hand against the wall. He looked terrible. The dark circles beneath his eyes had become bruises. His movements were slower, heavier, as though his body was operating on reserves that had already been spent. They were destroying each other. On the fifth day, Drenna came to the healer's quarters. "You look like death," the second observed, leaning against the doorframe with her arms crossed. "Thank you," Sable managed. "You look lovely as well." Something that might have been a smile flickered across Drenna's scarred face. "He is worse than you are. He has not slept in 4 days. He collapsed during a war council yesterday. Caught himself before anyone noticed, but I noticed." Sable's heart clenched. "He will not see me. He has guards posted." "I know," Drenna said. "I assign them." She paused. "I can also reassign them." Sable looked up sharply. Drenna's expression was carefully neutral. "The king believes he is protecting you by keeping you away. He is wrong. He will not listen to me. He will not listen to Brindis. The only person who has ever gotten through to that man is currently sitting in a dark room, looking like she has not eaten in 3 days. 4, Sable corrected quietly. Drenna's jaw tightened. "Tonight, after midnight, the eastern stairwell will be unguarded. His door will be unlocked." She straightened. "What you do with that information is your decision." She left without waiting for a response. Sable sat in the dark room and pressed her hands together until the shaking stopped. Midnight arrived like a held breath. Sable moved through the corridors on bare feet, her heart hammering. The eastern stairwell was empty, just as Drenna had promised. His door was unlocked. She pushed it open and stepped inside. The room was dark except for the low glow of dying embers in the fireplace. The air was thick with his scent, concentrated and heavy, and it hit her like a wall. Her wolf lunged forward with a desperate, keening need that buckled her knees. He was sitting on the edge of the bed, not lying down, not even attempting to sleep. Just sitting in the dark, his elbows on his knees, his head in his hands. The posture of a man who had run out of options and was simply waiting for the end. He sensed her before she spoke. His head came up, and even in the dim light, she could see the devastation written across his face. "Sable." Her name came out broken. "You should not be here." "And you should not be dying," she replied, her voice cracking on the last word. She crossed the room before he could protest. This close, she could see the tremors running through his hands, the way his body swayed with exhaustion. "You are trying to protect me," she said. "But you cannot protect me from a bond that is already forming. Pushing me away does not save me. It kills us both." His throat worked. "You do not understand what I am." "Then tell me." His eyes found hers, and what she saw in them was not the iron control of a king. It was the raw, shattered desperation of a man being consumed from the inside. "The war," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "The things I did in that war. There is something wrong with me, Sable. Something the war broke. It poisons everything it touches, and I will not let it poison you." Sable knelt in front of him and took his face in her hands. His skin was fever hot. "You are not poison," she said fiercely. "You are exhausted and grieving and too stubborn to let anyone help you carry it. But I am here, and I am not leaving." "I am the king," he said, but there was no authority in it. just exhaustion. I can make you do anything. Try, Sable whispered. His forehead dropped against hers. His hands came up and wrapped around her wrists, not to pull her away but to hold her there. She felt the shudder run through his entire body, felt the last wall of resistance crack and begin to crumble. If I let you stay, he breathed, I will not be able to let you go. Good, Sable said, because I am not going anywhere. His arms closed around her, pulling her against his chest with a desperation that stole her breath. She felt his face press into the curve of her neck, felt his lungs expand as he breathed her in, and felt his body begin, finally, impossibly, to release. She held him in the dark and waited. Within minutes, his weight shifted. His grip loosened. His breathing deepened into the slow, steady rhythm she had come to know as well as her own heartbeat. He was asleep, sitting upright, his arms still around her, his face buried in her neck. Asleep in seconds, as if his body had been waiting for permission that only she could give. Sable eased him back onto the bed, carefully, gently, cradling his head until it rested against the pillows. His hand found hers even in sleep and held on. She climbed onto the bed beside him, lay down and let his warmth surround her. The ache in her bones began to recede. The pain behind her eyes softened. Her wolf settled for the first time in 5 days, curling inward with a sigh of relief so profound it brought tears to her eyes. She was still holding his hand when sleep pulled her under. And then the darkness came. She was standing in a field of ash, fine and gray and falling from a sky that held no sun, no stars, no color at all. It drifted down like silent snow, coating the world in soft, suffocating nothing. The ground beneath her feet was black and yielding and warm, like the surface of a wound that had never closed. The air smelled of char and iron and grief. "Kale," she called out. Her voice came out flat, swallowed before it could carry. No echo, no response. Just the terrible, patient silence of a place that had been waiting a very long time. She found him in a clearing where the ash thinned just enough to see. Kale was on his knees, not kneeling, not choosing to kneel, but brought to his knees by something invisible and enormous pressing down on his shoulders. His head was bowed, his hands flat against the warm black ground, and his breathing was ragged and broken in a way she had never heard from him before. "Kale." She rushed toward him, dropping to her knees beside him. "Look at me." He did not respond. His eyes were open, but they were fixed on something ahead of him, something in the ash that she could not yet see. The expression on his face was not fear. It was acceptance. The hollow, devastated surrender of a man who had stopped fighting. Then she heard them. Voices. Hundreds of them, rising from the ash like heat from embers. They overlapped and tangled, creating a sound that was not quite language but communicated everything. Pain, accusation, sorrow so deep it vibrated in her bones. Figures materialized in the ash fall, soldiers with wounds that gaped but did not bleed, wolves frozen between shapes, civilians, women, children, elders, their eyes hollow and fixed on the king, the dead. These were the dead from the war, his war. They surrounded the clearing in a silent, accusing ring, and Kale watched them. Everyone. His eyes moved from face to face as if this was a ritual he had performed 1,000 times before and would perform 1,000 times more. "This is the curse," Sable whispered, understanding flooding through her like ice water. "This is where he goes every night. Not a nightmare, a prison, built from his own guilt, reinforced by magic and locked from the inside." Through the bond, she felt what he felt. The weight of it nearly flattened her. Guilt so vast it had its own gravity. Every life lost, every face he could not save, every decision that had cost someone their breath. Distilled into this endless field of ash and presented to him, night after night after night. The voices grew louder. The ring of the dead tightened. One figure stepped forward from the rest. A boy, young, 14 at most, with dark hair matted against his forehead and a wound across his chest that split his tunic from shoulder to hip. He walked with a limp that suggested something broken beneath the surface, and his eyes, too old for his face, were fixed on the king. "Joran," Kale breathed. The name cracked open something in him. Sable felt it through the bond, a fissure splitting through his control, and the memory poured through before either of them could stop it. She saw it, felt it, lived it. A village on the border. Smoke rising, the Kale wolves descending on a settlement that intelligence had marked as a military outpost. But the intelligence had been wrong. There were families inside. The boy had run toward the line carrying a white banner fashioned from a bedsheet, screaming for them to stop. In the chaos, someone had not seen the banner, or had seen it and had been unable to stop the arrow already loosed. The boy had fallen. The banner drifted down after him like a shroud. Kale had held him while he died, the bedsheet turning red in his hands. The memory released its grip. Sable gasped, tears streaming down her face, her chest heaving with borrowed grief so enormous she could barely contain it. The ghost boy, Joran, stood before the king and spoke. His voice was soft, almost gentle, which made it infinitely worse. "You sent them. You gave the order. You could have waited for better intelligence. You could have confirmed. But you were tired of waiting, and people died because of it." Kale did not argue, did not defend. He bowed his head lower and the ash settled on his shoulders like a mantle. Because he agreed. Sable could feel it radiating through the bond. He believed every word. He believed he deserved this, all of it, every night in this ash-covered prison. The curse did not need to be strong. It only needed to find the crack in him and pour itself in, and the crack was his own conviction that he had earned this punishment. That is why the curse has not broken, Sable realized. It is not holding him here. He is holding himself. The dead pressed closer, their whispers crescendoed. Sable stood. "Stop," she said. The whispers faltered. The figures wavered in the ash like candle flames in a draft. "Stop," she said again, louder, and this time the word carried. It cut through the ash and the silence and the terrible, patient weight of the dead, and it reached him. Kale's head lifted. His eyes found hers, and they were empty. Scraped clean by years of this, of being hollowed out every night and reassembled every morning into a man who could still function. Sable dropped to her knees in front of him. She took his face in her hands, the ash warm and gritty against her palms, and forced him to look at her. "You made a decision in a war," she said, her voice shaking but clear. "A terrible decision, based on information that was wrong, in a conflict you did not start. And a boy died, and it was not your fault." "It was my order," he rasped. "It was your order given in good faith based on bad intelligence. You did not send them to kill children, and carrying this guilt does not bring him back. It just feeds this place." She looked at the ghost of Joran, at his young, solemn face. "You deserve to rest," she told the boy. "And so does he." Joran stared at her. Then his gaze shifted to Kale, and something in his expression changed. The accusation softened. The wound across his chest seemed to fade at the edges. "I was so scared," the boy whispered. But it was not anger in his voice anymore. It was grief. The simple, honest grief of a child who had died too young and had been trapped in someone else's guilt ever since. Sable's tears fell freely. "I know. I am so sorry." She turned back to Kale. "You have to let them go. Not because they do not matter, they always will, but because keeping them here is not remembrance. It is a cage. For them and for you. Through the bond, she felt the war inside him. The deep, entrenched belief that he deserved punishment fighting against something newer, something fragile and desperate that sounded like her voice saying, "You are not poison." "I do not know how to put it down," he said, and his voice broke on the last word. Sable pressed her forehead against his. "You do not have to put it down all at once. You just have to decide that you are allowed to try." The ash stopped falling. It happened all at once. A sudden, absolute stillness, as if the world had been holding its breath and had finally exhaled. The whispers died. The figures flickered. Kale's hands came up and covered hers. His grip was trembling, his breath ragged against her face. "I am sorry," he said, and this time he was not saying it to the dead, he was saying it to himself, granting himself the permission he had refused for 14 months. The boy smiled, small and sad and real. Then he dissolved into the ash, gently, without violence, like smoke rising into still air. The others followed. One by one, the dead released their hold on the living, turning away, fading, and in their faces Sable saw not accusation, but something that looked remarkably like relief. The ash began to lift from the ground, rising instead of falling, until the clearing was empty and the air was clean, and the silence was no longer suffocating, but simply quiet. Kale collapsed against her. She caught him, held him, wrapped her arms around his shaking body and pressed her face against his hair. "I have you," she whispered. "I am here." He wept. Silently, violently, his body convulsing with the force of grief that had been locked inside him for years. She held on and did not let go. She woke in his bed, in his arms, in the warm amber light of early morning. The fire had burned down to embers. The fortress was quiet. Kale was awake, looking at her. His eyes were red-rimmed and raw, but they were clear. Clearer than she had ever seen them. He cupped her face with one hand, his thumb tracing the line of her cheekbone. "How long?" she asked. "I do not know," he said, but there were no dreams, no ash, nothing. His voice cracked on the last word, and she watched the wonder break across his face like dawn breaking over the mountains. The disbelief. The fragile, terrified hope. She kissed him, rose up and pressed her mouth to his because there were no words left that could carry what she felt. He responded immediately, his hand sliding into her hair. She felt the bond flare between them, bright and warm and demanding. They chose each other deliberately, consciously, without reservation. Afterward, tangled together in the furs, she felt the bond settle into place. Not with violence or ceremony, but with a quiet, absolute certainty, like a key turning in a lock that had been waiting to be opened. She pressed her lips to the curve of his neck, marking him, and felt his answering claim against her shoulder, tender and fierce and possessive. The bond sealed, complete, irreversible. "They will not accept this easily," Kale murmured against her hair. "A Thornfeld woman as the Kyle Queen, the council will object." "Let them object," Sable said. He laughed, low and rough and real. A sound she had earned through weeks of darkness and stubbornness and sitting in the dark, telling stories until the most dangerous alpha in existence felt safe enough to close his eyes. "They will learn," he said, pulling her closer. "As I did." The curse did not vanish cleanly. Nothing ever does. There were still nights when the ash crept in at the edges of his dreams. Sable would reach for him in the dark, press her palm against his chest, and wait until his body remembered that it was safe. The nightmares grew less frequent. The spaces between them grew longer. Weeks, then months, stretching out like the warming days as winter loosened its grip on the northern mountains. Kale began to sleep through the night. Not every night, but most. And on the mornings after a full night's rest, he was a different man. Not softer exactly. He would always carry the weight of what he had done and what had been done around him, but lighter. More present. More willing to meet her eyes across a crowded room and let the corner of his mouth lift in the way that was meant only for her. Their mating was announced to the court on the first day of the spring thaw. The Kale wolves were suspicious of a Thornfeld woman in their king's bed. The Thornfeld delegation was mortified that their expendable bond offering had somehow become a queen. Sable stood beside Kale in the great hall and weathered it. His hand found hers beneath the table and held on, steady and warm and unapologetic. "If I may," Drenna said that evening, standing in the doorway of their chambers with the particular expression of someone who had been right about something for weeks and was finally being allowed to say so. "I told you she would be trouble." "You told me she would be useful," Kale replied. "Same thing," Drenna said, and left. Brindis continued to monitor the king's health. The reports improved steadily. The gaunt, haunted look that had lived behind his eyes for 14 months faded and was replaced by something warmer. Something that looked suspiciously like peace. "You are not cured," Brindis told him. "Grief does not cure, but you are healing. And that is a different and far more sustainable thing." Months passed. Sable established an expanded healer's wing, incorporating Southern herbal traditions alongside Northern practices. She trained new apprentices, fought with the supply master over herb shipments, and earned the grudging respect of wolves who had initially looked at her with contempt. She was no longer invisible. She was no longer expendable. One morning, deep into the summer, Sable woke to find the bed empty beside her. For one sharp, instinctive moment, fear spiked through her chest. Then she heard his voice from the window. "Come look," Kale said. She wrapped herself in a fur and padded across the room. He stood at the wide window, the morning light catching the mating mark on his neck, the scar she had given him, the one he wore like a declaration. She leaned into his side and looked out. The northern mountains stretched before them in the early light, their peaks catching the first gold of sunrise, the valleys still pooled in blue shadow. The forest below the fortress was green and dense and alive, and somewhere in it, wolves were howling. Not the foreign, unfamiliar call she had heard on her first night in Ashenir, but voices she now recognized. Pack voices. Her pack. "What am I looking at?" she asked. "Home," he said. Sable pressed her face against his shoulder and closed her eyes. His arm came around her and pulled her close, and they stood there in the growing light, two people who had been given to each other by circumstance and had chosen each other by something far more stubborn and far more lasting. The ash did not fall. The dead rested. The king slept. And in the morning, they woke together. Thank you so much for listening. I will see you very soon for the next story.